All right, so I think at this point it would probably be a good idea for us to begin the evening. And I want to welcome everybody. If you haven't ever heard of me or heard of our temple, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Rabbi Dan Geffen. I'm very privileged and honored to be the Rabbi of Temple Adass Israel in Sag Harbor. And we are really deeply privileged tonight and really hopeful tonight to have two remarkable guest speakers who I will introduce in a moment. Not just guest speakers, guest teachers. Okay, I want to emphasize that word, guest teachers tonight. But there are two other people, as you may see on your screen, that I want to introduce before we get started, and that is the co-chairs of our Social Justice Committee here at the Temple, Andrea Klausner, who, Andrea, maybe you want to just wave your hand there, and Alyssa Peak. They will come back a little bit later in the evening just to share some details about our Social Justice Committee for those who might want to get involved in some of our work. But first and foremost, I wanted to thank the two of them because without them, this evening would not have happened. And it is all of our appreciation and gratitude to the two of you for what you have been doing, what you continue to do, and for helping really to put this evening together. So I promise we'll give you a chance to speak a little bit later on, but we applaud you and we thank you very much for your involvement tonight.
We'd rather hear from the three of you.
Yeah. And we're gonna move you into the attendee space. You can go sit with your bows, I imagine, hopefully. And let me just do that really quickly, everybody. Forgive me for 1 second. Okay. Nope. Hopefully that worked. They'll forgive me for kicking them out. But and now it really is my honor to introduce our two guest teachers for this evening, two really remarkable people in their own right, and who have made special accommodation to be here and to share their wisdom, their knowledge, their experience with us. And also, I should mention that while we may have started this process originally thinking this was going to be only for the members of Temple Adass Israel, this has expanded out, including our first presenter, who I will introduce, Reverend Kimberly Quinn Johnson of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of the South Fork, who has, of course, dear friends of mine, dear friends in all of the work that we have done over the last few years. And many of whom are joining us this evening. So I welcome all of our UU friends, especially for being here, and all of those who are connected to Reverend Kimberly from other points in life. So just by way of introduction and knowing how humble she is, I'm sure that this could have been 10 times longer, but it's just not Reverend Kimberly's way. But Reverend Kimberly Quinn Johnson serves, as I said, as the minister of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of the South Fork on Long Island, that is located in the Bridgehampton-Sag Harbor Turnpike. She has a passion and expertise for racial justice work and ministry with youth. Before ministry, Kimberly worked as a union organizer with the UAW. She also taught women's and gender studies at New Jersey City University. The core of Kimberly's ministry is faith formation, creating spaces and experiences for people to connect to the sacred and to express that connection in the world. In her teaching, Kimberly employs the theory and practice of popular education, facilitating the exchange and exploration of our knowledge and experiences to encourage deeper understanding and grounding for action. So Reverend Kimberly, my friends, my teacher, we welcome you tonight and we thank you for being here.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
Our other wonderful guest teacher, speaker, presenter this evening is James Dr. Love Banks. We're going to call him Dr. Love for the rest of the night because we need more of this in the world, primarily. So we welcome you. Dr. Love, amongst his many, many, many roles, I will read only a few of them, but really a remarkable presence, especially on the East End. One of his great talents is as a teacher, as an educator, as a helper of young people. He is the college-wide coordinator of multicultural affairs at, I assume it's Suffolk County Community College?
Yes.
Correct? He is the chairperson of the Southampton Anti-Bias Task Force. He is the chairperson of the Suffolk County African American Advisory Board. He is a consultant to the Center for Social Justice and Human Understanding. He is a co-chairman and board member of the African American Educational and Cultural Festival. He is a board member of Southampton African American Museum, a member of MBK Steering Committee. He is an executive director of the Institute for Family Harmony and Personal Growth. He is a board member of Focus, and he is a personal member of the Education Committee of the Multicultural Solidarity Group, the Brookhaven NAACP, and Stand Up to Poverty. So, Dr. Love, we welcome you this evening as well. We are deeply honored, privileged to have you here, to have you both here with us. And in a moment, we'll begin our process of learning for the night. And just to set a couple of intentions, a couple of hopefully reasonable expectations for the evening. One is that, of course, we're using technology that is not always 100% exactly what we might want. Many of you are used to using Zoom where you can see each other and see everything. Because we had such a remarkable sign up and registration for this program, we exceeded the reasonable facilities of a normal Zoom. And so we are using what's called a webinar function, which means you won't be able to see each other. You'll be able to see the three of us. You are limited in your chat, but what you can do is to chat to the panelists. In other words, to the three of us. As most of you who signed up knew, we offer the opportunity for pre-registered questions, of which we have culled a list and tried to combine some of them that address similar topics. We also don't know for sure exactly how it will run in the end, but if we have time, we will try to take additional questions that may appear during our presentation this evening. And lastly, just a word about reasonable expectations for tonight. As remarkable as our guest speakers and teachers are, and as much as I'm sure they would spend hours with us to help us to learn and to grow and ultimately to help change our world for the better, we will eventually have to bring this evening to a close. But that does not by any means mean that the conversation stops here tonight. We won't be able to answer every question. We may not answer every question that was submitted exactly as it was submitted. But our goal and our attention tonight is to begin a conversation and to deepen the connections to each other, so that as we continue on, as the days and the weeks and the years that are to come, where we are needed desperately to understand, to learn, to act, to listen, that we will have a beginning point. And hopefully, when we look back many years from now, many of us will look back to this night as the beginning of something that hopefully will lead to a radical transformation of the nature and the fabric of this country, the ways in which we see and hear and relate and love and appreciate each other. All of these things begin in a moment just like this. So I really, and I'm saying this not with hyperbole, but with seriousness and with genuineness, this is one of the most meaningful experiences that I have been a part of since I have become a rabbi. And I hope that each and every one of you will take away from tonight something that will propel you each in your own way and us collectively, again, to create the change in the world that we want to see. So I am going to then step back, which is not an easy thing for a rabbi, as you know. We are not known for being quiet, but I am going to do my very best to help to facilitate the conversation and to begin our process this evening. And we're going to start with where I think is a good place to start, which is getting to know each of you a little bit and a little bit about your background and how you came to this area. So I'll ask the question first, and Reverend Kimberly or Dr. Love, you can decide who will go first. But the question is, how long have you lived or been living here on the east end of Long Island? And how would you identify or compare your experiences living here to other places perhaps where you have either lived or where you grew up?
I will defer to the Reverend.
Awesome.
Always a good answer.
I've lived on the east end of Long Island. I live in East Hampton and work in Bridgehampton for almost 5 years. I came out here in August of 2015 to serve as minister of our congregation. And my experience of Long Island and my experience of the East End is that it is the most segregated place I have ever lived. Before this, I lived for a while in DC. I lived in Cambridge. I lived in Boston, and I still think that Long Island, Boston, which is notoriously one of the most racist cities in the country, and I still think that Long Island is the most segregated place that I've lived. Even in my neighborhood, my predominantly Black neighborhood in New Jersey, we are still in regular contact with multi-ethnic people, back and forth into the city every day, even around my cities in New Jersey, still regular contact with lots of different people and different kinds of people. That has not been my experience here on Long Island. Some of you may have read the study in Newsday that talks about Long Island as one of the most segregated places in the country. Our school districts as one of the most segregated school districts in the country. And there are historical reasons for that. There are continuing present reasons for that. What that means for me is that I need to work harder and be really intentional about being in relationship with other Black people and other people of color.
Very nice. All right, thank you. I actually moved to Long Island in the early 70s. That was after I had been in the Marine Corps and grew up in the South Bronx, and then also in Eastern Bronx. All right. So I've lived in a lot of different locations in New York. And my experience is similar to your own. Of all the places I've lived, of course, is much more segregated than the South Bronx.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I moved to the Eastern Bronx, and when I moved to Throgs Neck too, I moved there for a while, just across the bridge. That was even segregated, but not like Long Island. When I first moved out to this end of the Long Island island, I had this experience of trying to buy a house. And so it was in keeping with what Newsday has been reporting. I had some difficulty in terms of finding a house in a multicultural neighborhood like that, like what I desired. So that was it. But as far as like how I came to being involved in diversity and multicultural affairs, is that I've lived that all my life. In the South Bronx, my friends were all Latinos and Latinx folks, and in Throgs Neck, they were very multicultural. However, the community that surrounded us was not multicultural. It was more prejudiced and racist. And then when I finally got situated in Long Island, I went through 3 houses and ended up living in Bellport, which is a pretty diverse neighborhood in the part where I live. But the rest of my experience when I left my neighborhoods was not as diverse as I would have preferred it to be.
Well, I think that helps us certainly to get an important perspective right off the front, and to understand certainly that sometimes in order to get any kind of perspective, you have to be able to draw from other experiences and to be able to compare. And certainly it is an essential piece for us to realize that what you're describing is not a small thing. Who you see and who you interact with and what you hear as you're walking down the street, these things have very, very deep applications, very deep roots. It's one of the things that I've always acknowledged that one of the greatest gifts of being able to grow up in the city was the fact that that was my world, right? I was surrounded by things that my daughter does not experience, right? She doesn't hear the different voices. She doesn't see the different faces. And that is a serious and very real problem. So thank you for beginning by giving us your personal insight into this. And I think that it's a natural segue to our next question, which is one that's, I know, on a lot of our minds, certainly in our community here, which is that we hear a lot about this word privilege, and in particular, this idea or concept of white privilege. So can you help to tell us, and I'm asking you to do this, tell us the truth, okay? Don't sugarcoat it. Don't make it easier for us to digest it. We need to hear some real realities here. So please help us to understand what this term means, what this terminology means, and not just what it means, but how we are meant to relate to it and ultimately to learn and grow from acknowledging of it.
Yeah, maybe we'll rotate back and forth, I guess, or something.
Yes, that'd be great.
Sorry, yes,
Since we believe in equality and equity,
yeah.
When we talk about white privilege and talk about privilege, a lot of folks think that, the only thing I have, I've gotten because of hard work, etc. But the fact is that when it comes to white privilege, most of white privilege comes as a result of people not having to do anything to earn it. It is automatic just by being white. all right? And that privilege then influences how people treat you. It influences the schools you go to. It influences just about all phases of your life. You know, we have to talk about at some later point in this discussion, talk about some of the systems and things like that that have really been very imposing on people of color, and therefore then affecting people people who are not people of color, because we all suffer when we don't enjoy and experience diversity.
Thank you. I like to describe it for people as a system of unearned and unacknowledged advantages that smooth your way through life, that make things easier. And this thing about not having to do anything to claim it is really important, because part of the way that privilege is intended to operate is for people to take it for granted, to not notice, to assume that the way things happen is the natural order of things. So imagine, and for most of you, you don't have to imagine, that your life, your world, your institutions, your schools, your hospitals, your churches are organized around your experience, organized around the experiences of people that look like you, so that those experiences are taken for granted as regular and normal, and the experiences of people who don't look like you are seen as irregular, abnormal, and also implicitly not as good. When I teach about it, I use this article that people probably have heard about from Peggy McIntosh. She talks about your invisible white privilege backpack. And she gives some examples that people might be familiar with, right? And some of them seem fairly benign. That an example of white privilege is that you can find flesh-toned Band-Aids or flesh-toned pantyhose or flesh-toned anything, right? Flesh-toned is this peachish color that is supposed to look like white skin. But there are also things like not being followed in a store when you go into a store. Seeing people like yourself in leadership and authority, seeing yourself represented positively in culture, being stopped by the police and not being seen as a threat, right? That I am seen as a threat, that my brother and my fathers are seen as a threat, is literally deadly for them.
A lot of the descriptions that you gave, Reverend Kimberly, are actually the food and the fuel for white supremacy and the perspective of white supremacy. Often when we talk about things like police brutality and things like that, people don't recognize that even the police have been socialized to look upon people of color in a lesser way. And they're socialized by the very things that you discussed as being part of the systems, part of what we experience, part of what happens when we go in the store, part of the way they treat people. You know, there's a woman named Susan D'Angelo who wrote a book called White Fragility. And she talks about, she gives an example of a kid in a store, all right, with his mother. And the kid says, "Look, Mom, that man is black." And everybody in the store that heard it within the earshot became totally uncomfortable. And she said to him, "Shh." All right. And if he had said, "Look, Mom, that man is white," that would not have garnered the same response. So we have to start to think about those things, because when a child, I'm walking down the street holding the hand of my child or my little sibling or my brother, and they see that going on, they're being socialized as an underclass. And that is really horrific when it comes to the psyche and the self-esteem and even the aspirations of people of color, all right, and particularly Blacks.
This is extremely important and extremely helpful. And one of the most recent examples that I had heard, and it became news, and I couldn't believe that this was news, but it was, I think, Walgreens and another major chain
Mhm.
publicly announced that they would no longer be locking up hair products that are designed for, and it was mind-boggling to me. But it's a perfect example of a situation in which I will walk down the aisle of a store. Clearly, I'm not looking for hair products, but no matter what it is, all those calculations, all those things that have to go in your head, just walking into the store, just don't happen for me or for people that look like me in the same way and any way. And so as we talk about this word, I understand, part of the reason that we wanted to address it tonight and address it fully is that when we hear this word privilege, our first instinct on this end a lot of times is to go like this, right? As Dr. Love pointed out, right? What do you mean privilege? But this is exactly what we are talking about. And the most insidious aspect of racism is how easily it is camouflaged and given other names and given other terminologies so that we don't even have a cognition of the fact that we are part of something that is, without question, directed towards delegitimizing, demonizing, making into as they both pointed out, a threat, which is the most absurd. And it is essential that we understand and to take into this, that this is not about pointing a finger at us in this way. It's about illuminating. It's about opening our eyes to something that we otherwise would not see. And I will just say as a quick aside, in Judaism, this is an essential part of education. Don't assume that you can see everything. Don't assume that you can know. One of the reasons that we are taught from a very early age is to go find teachers is because we know we are born with certain kinds of blinders on. We need to be able to hear and to learn. So this was an extremely important piece to address. And I think it's a natural segue again, as Dr. Love here pointed out, that we are into the next question which relates to all of this, right? Because if you have a system in place in which this privilege is allowed to, again, permeate every aspect of society, especially in unconscious kinds of ways, that we naturally get to this other element that we call white supremacy. And we hear this now, again, especially at the forefront of most of our conversations recently. And that, of course, as I think we can anticipate, same principle as when we hear about white privilege, right? You hear white supremacy and people's responses, again, to become defensive about it. So can you help us first to understand and define a word that we often use, but we maybe don't even realize or think about what it actually means? Can you help us first understand what racism means? Can you help us define that core definition? And then can you tell us how this then also relates to the definition of white supremacy and why this term is chosen as the term as opposed to something perhaps that is has less of, I don't know, an edge to it or something like that, that we need to deal with a terminology that is accurate in its description. And then I will turn it back over. So I think Reverend Kimberly, the tennis ball on the court is back.
Yeah, bounces to her.
I probably don't catch a tennis ball this
No,
way.
but look, hoops is a much more natural thing for me. So we'll chest pass, just like this one.
So I have a working definition for racism, and then I'm going to tell you why I use white supremacy more often than racism lately. My working definition for racism is prejudice plus power, right? And so lots of people get caught up on the prejudice idea. So you'll hear talk of reverse racism, that anytime anybody has any kind of prejudice against anyone else, that is an example of racism. It is not. Racism is both the combination of power and prejudice. It's the power to be able to act on your prejudice in order to restrict people's opportunities and access. It's more than just stereotype or bias or not liking somebody or the way that they do things. It really is about power.
That is so key. That's the piece that people don't understand. That's when they start to accuse, for example, people of color for being racist. They leave out the fact that these people cannot really be racist because they don't have the power. They don't have the organizational power. They don't have the financial or economic power. And so therefore they are not racist. They can be prejudiced, but not racist. And I think that, usually when they use the terms, it really has to do with how groups in white supremacist attitudes marginalize or deal with minorities, all right? And they do marginalize them in so many ways. You know, when I talk about white supremacy, which is the other part of this question, I make sure that I talk about the fact of who actually is in control of the narratives that we pay attention to. You know, in recent history, they've been talking about, as the rabbi said, things that stores are doing to try to change the narrative. You know, that they're going to get rid of Aunt Jemima pancakes mix, and they're going to get rid of Uncle Ben's rice, and things that really substantiated this hierarchical perspective that people lived with and operated under, and where they learned some of their messages. So, you know, who controls the narrative? Well, let's take a look at who all our teachers are. You know, they like 82% of the teachers in our schools are white. Okay, we can go on, and I really think it's important for us to look at that. We can look at the fact that 84% of our college professors are white. Okay, and I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with them being white, except if they themselves have not been exposed to people of color and consequently cannot work collaboratively or collectively in helping to raise or lift them up in equity or in equal kinds of ways. And then, you know, this just every phase of our system has hierarchical levels that are operated by white supremacists. People think when you talk about white supremacy that you're talking about the KKK or skinheads and stuff like that. No, it permeates everything that we are exposed to. It's when an African American child goes into a classroom and does not see a teacher, okay, that looks like him or her, and goes to the next class and the same thing is true, and on and on and on. When that becomes commonplace, that is saying white supremacy. When banks don't give loans to people of color because they don't think that their credit is worthy or whatever the reasons, that is white supremacy. You can walk wherein I might not be able to walk in the bank and get a loan. Well, I might be able to now, but I might not have been able to historically when my friend Mike could have. And my friend Mike has a lesser job, okay, in terms of income wise. You know, so the thing I like to talk about is that it's in our minds and in our hearts all the time. And you know, the last thing I'll say, so I don't hog the mic too long, okay, is that, you know, I like to use the example of my yard sale. I held a yard sale in my home when I lived in Bellport, which I don't live in anymore, okay? But, and my friend Mike, who was blonde haired and blue eyed, was there standing in the yard sale with me. And it was just, I guess it was really absolutely disarming how people would walk right past me and ask him how much the items that belonged to me cost. And Mike said, I don't know, why don't you ask the owner? You know, Mike is that kind of directly speaking kind of human being. So those are the kinds of things that we experience all the time. You know, that my children, when we lived in Bellport, got dropped off in other communities, just other parts of the community because of the darkness of their complexion. Those are white supremacist responses and reactions that we live with every day. That I have to teach my children or my sons to put their hands on the steering wheel if ever stopped by the police, okay? And announce, I'm going in my glove compartment to get my registration. You know, those kinds of things. And, you know, we could go on and on and on. But the fact is that white supremacy is something that we experience every day, whether we're white or black or Latinx or anything. And it becomes embedded into our socialization. It's an everyday thing we experience.
And Dr. Love, I want to say, It matters not just who is at the front of the classroom. It matters who determines what the curricula is, who determines what books you're using, who writes the books that you're using, whose experience is centered. What I find useful about white supremacy is that it moves us away from a conversation about interpersonal relationships, who likes whomever, into understanding this as a concept of dominance. White supremacy is a concept of dominance.
Yes.
That one group, and we can talk about male supremacy, we can talk about class supremacy, but that one group is better than another and ought to be able to dominate that group. And some of the ways that that is expressed is really explicit in law and policy and interpersonal relationships. But some of the ways that that is expressed is really subtle, like whose experience is centered, whose experience is seen as normal, and who's abnormal or special.
Yeah, the figures about the things, the items that you identified, you know, are immense. When you figure that 96% or 90% of the books are written and published by whites, you know, that's controlling the narrative. When you figure who owns all of the big sports teams, they determine whites, okay? You know, the president's cabinet, and we could go on and on and on. And the point is that the message is reinforced and emphasized in all walks of our lives. And that then brings us to the notion of systemic racism. It's in the system. Everywhere you go, it's in the system. Who you know, how young people end up in special education. Those horrid IQ tests that they used to give them, all right? That was a way of saying, nope, you belong in a special class, ride the small yellow bus instead of the larger bus. And consequently, you were perceived as hierarchically less than other people. You know, so it's everywhere. And I agree with you, Reverend Kim, it's everywhere we look, and it's not just those in front of the class, it's those in the class, and it's the books that we read in all of those. So if I'd like to reinforce that, because classrooms ought to be bringing a diversity of books also. You know, one of the things that, and the last thing I'll say, okay, is that one of the things that I'd like to reinforce also is that diversity means a diversity of opinion and thought too, not just diversity of color or of gender or race. It also means a diversity of thought. So how do we move from a place where we can use my acronym, which I call HOPE, healing our past experiences, or the other acronym, which is SIN. How can we move from being stuck in negative to a place where we can move forward? It's not the same sin that we learned about in our spiritual learnings, all right? It's a different one. And how can we move people from there, and how can we ourselves move from there? And one way first I'd like to always talk about is getting in touch with it in ourselves. And we need to recognize that it's not absent from any of us. We need to own up to our pieces.
I just want to say one more thing about white supremacy before we move on, because you don't need to be a bad actor to be enmeshed in white supremacy or white supremacist culture. We started talking about white supremacy in our own faith and among Unitarian Universalists and among sort of the leadership of our faith about 3 or 4 years ago. And one of the things that we noticed when someone brought this to larger attention is if you looked at our staff, especially the staff at our headquarters, something like at the very top of our leadership, something like it was 10% people of color and 90% white. If you look at the very bottom rungs of our staff, right, the people who were service workers, it was more like 90% people of color and 10% white, right? So you don't need to be bad actors. It happens when you don't pay attention and you aren't actually intentional.
And we need to pay a big attention to that, because I think it's really outstanding for us to recognize who they now are calling essential workers.
Mm-hmm.
All right, because those very people who have been lesser as far as how they've been regarded are the ones that are most needed.
Yeah.
Okay.
I do want to say, in our own faith, we have done a yeoman's job, really great work in shifting the way that looks. But, you know, there's this quote that I'm going to get wrong from James Baldwin: not everything that you face can be fixed, but nothing can be fixed unless you face it. You have to face it.
And it is hard for us to face it, all of us, because of the socialization piece and how we've been taught, and also how we experience life. I can understand when people are uncomfortable or unhappy because of what they've experienced in their lives. You know, as a counselor, I often have to talk about that. You know, I remember having people walk out of my office once they came in and saw that I was big, beautiful, and chocolate, you know, and I said, you know what, that is their loss. And I did not let it anger me. I let it empower me to do more work to address those kinds of disparities.
I think this is an essential part of our conversation tonight, and again, one of the beginnings of many conversations to follow, because I imagine for many of us tonight, this is a hard truth, right? This is prophetic. That's the tradition of the prophets is one in which, right, that they all stood up, oftentimes at great risk to their own lives, to hold a mirror up to society and to say, you must look, right? You're not going to be able, as you said, you're not going to be able to make any kind of change unless the first thing that we can do is to look and to realize and see our place in this. So as you were talking about it, right, and thinking about my entire life, the idea that I could ever be associated with a phrase like white supremacist, the furthest thing from my imagination, right? But as you're describing it, clearly, I am part of this conversation. It doesn't matter about whether I intended to be or not. I am part of this narrative. And the only way that I can begin to even start to untangle that relationship is to first identify and be willing to identify that. And I just did it on a Zoom with 100 people, and we'll go online, I'll say the same. And it's important. It's an important personal experience that I had tonight to hear that from the two of you. And I appreciate the care with which you said it, but also the seriousness with which you said it and the honesty with which you said it. It will help me, and I hope many of us on the call tonight, to be able to grow from understanding what that is. I mean, I saw an article the other day, I honestly couldn't believe it, but even the artificial intelligence, the computer programs that are being programmed, right? There was this example, I think it was Microsoft's webpage or something like that. I don't even remember exactly the specifics of how it played out, but it was clear that even in the coding that goes into a non-thinking entity, right, a thing that we as human beings have created, we are programming in, most likely, again, not even necessarily conscious of the fact that that's what we're doing. Okay, and that is becoming an increasingly large challenge as you know, we hear about the usage of facial recognition, things of that nature, right? This plays into every one of those conversations. And again, I think that's one of the key takeaways already. We're not even probably halfway through the night. Already the key takeaways, right, is understanding that we have to, in essence, put on a different set of eyes. We have to look differently. We have to look at details differently, and especially the ones that we are uncomfortable by. So really, I appreciate. And you know, we have one question. I'm going to skip just a little bit from one of our questions that were submitted ahead of time, because I think it relates directly to what came up. And I think, Dr. Love, you were already starting to go in this direction. But we've been hearing a lot lately about the idea of structural or systemic racism, and also an accompanying terminology of unconscious bias. So we've already addressed some of that here, but can you help us to understand, and perhaps if you can give us even some examples, although you have already done so, some examples that we can understand what it means that there is a systemic racist issue in our country, and how then, by understanding that, perhaps how we can better understand how to reorient, if not entirely dismantle, some of these systems, if not all of them.
Yeah, I'll let Reverend Kim go first on that one, but I'd like to say even Larry Kudlow, a member of our government, all right, said the other day on the news that there's no such thing as systemic racism. And I can't believe that a person in that position, I can believe it, but a person in that position was saying such a thing over the airs. all right? Letting the nation know that there's some disparities in the way he thinks with respect to people of color. But go ahead, Dr. Kim.
I'm laughing at that. I am rarely dismissive of people. I hope it's true that I'm rarely dismissive of people. But when you say that, I had this meme that had been popular in the winter. Okay, boomer.
Right.
Okay, boomer. Sit down.
Yeah.
So I think those are two different things: implicit bias and structural racism. So let me start with implicit bias, which feels pretty simple. So,
and I'll take structural.
I'm gonna. Okay. So implicit bias, it's just the ways it describes the way that we have a sort of unconscious, subconscious attitudes and expectations and stereotypes about people of a different race or a different gender, or people who are fat, or people who are disabled. And our brains are making snap judgments all the time. It is the way that our brains work, to make snap judgments. So the fact that we make snap judgments isn't actually the problem. The problem is what those judgments are. And so we tend to judge things that are unfamiliar as negative. And so if you are unfamiliar with people of a different race, then you are likely to have some negative bias towards those people. Or if you are bombarded over and over and over and over again with messages that say, these kinds of people are criminal, these kinds of people are lazy, these kinds of people are unhealthy and don't care about themselves and their children, then you are likely to see those kinds of people with negative bias.
That's so true. It's really so difficult for us to get away from that kind of orientation, that definitely influences our thinking. I like to talk, when I talk about structural or systemic racism, I like to talk about the fact that it's really like the, like was being said earlier, it's really, you need to ask yourself, does it exist? When someone who is Black has who has an advanced degree, has a lesser job than someone with a high school diploma, just because this person is Black, that says something. It's there. Now, we could find reasons for why that could occur, all right? But so frequently, when white families have 10 times the net worth of Black families, okay, there's reasons for that you could probably identify occasionally, all right? But so frequently, when a half of the Black males don't have jobs, and or when they do have jobs are being paid so much less. It's almost like the same discrimination that happens to women. It irks me every day when I hear that women are still making 75 cents to $1 on what males make in doing the same job. That is ridiculous. That is ridiculous. It's hierarchically subordinating. It's ridiculous. And no wonder kids sometimes have a hard time understanding who and who not to respect when they're getting those kinds of messages, or how to respect them when they're getting those kinds of messages. It permeates every system in our country, every system. Even when we talk about things like the recidivism rate in prison, forget about it. We could talk about that for days, all right? But people go to prison, the school to prison pipeline, all right, is talked about all the time. They end up in prison, all right, instead of getting a fine job. Why? Because the system does not allow for them to get the better job. And people will say, they should pick themselves up by their bootstraps. I say that, in some of the communities where I lived, they didn't even have boots, never mind the straps. So some of the things that we need to consider is that we need to get rid of those mythological ways to look at these things and get right to the core. Why? Why is this happening? And what can we do about it?
Very powerful.
So somebody had asked for some examples. I'll give you some not origin stories, but some places where you can really look historically at where this had a big impact. Let's look at the GI Bill, right? The GI Bill, which was responsible for generations of people being able to get educated and being able to raise themselves into middle class. So on paper, any soldier would have had access to the GI Bill. But if you can't use the GI Bill at a historically Black college, and a Black person can't get into any other college, then essentially you actually don't have access to the GI Bill. Or Social Security. When Social Security was enacted, who it left out? Farm workers and domestic workers. Who in this country were farm workers and domestic workers excluded from Social Security? Housing discrimination through redlining or restrictive covenants, or just flat out bias and not showing people houses in neighborhoods that were not Black or that were not sort of suited to their race. Even things that seem not structural, but are. So I'm going to tell you about not a particular study, but a whole field of study around race and pain. It is well documented that medical professionals, regardless of their race, attribute less pain to Black patients. So you can see the same two patients, they are telling you the same thing. You are going to understand the white person to be experiencing more and different pain than the Black person. You are going to treat them differently. You are going to prescribe to them differently. That's an example of systemic and structural racism.
And way back to Thomas Jefferson, all right, who tried to justify or rationalize why he had slaves and why people who were Black were his slaves. He tried to identify that they were physically different. And he tried to identify that over and over again so as to justify and help himself be more comfortable. And he was a brilliant man in a lot of ways. But one of the things that people don't understand about these kinds of issues is that there's a mystified, mythological, unconscious desire to sustain or retain one's status, all right, when it comes to white supremacy. We want, people want to hold on to what they got, and they don't even know that they're doing it half the time. Because if you had an ice cream cone and I had a potato chip, okay, wouldn't you want to hold on to your ice cream cone? As a very simple analogy, because it had more value, it had more status. And that's kind of a real struggle for us in this country, is how do we get past that? What can we talk about to deal with it? This morning I was doing a workshop with some, and I won't go off on a tangent on that, with a parenting organization in Buffalo, and talking about how what we need to do to help our children deal with these inconsistencies and understand it. How do you tell a young person, no, that's for them, not for you? How do you talk to them about about why your body language is different in some places and not in others? Yeah. All of those are a big struggle for people, and we all need to be aware of it and address it in us. When people talk to me and they lower their voice when they say Black, their voice all of a sudden gets softer, as though there's something wrong with it. That's why I say I'm big, beautiful, and chocolate, or Black, because there's nothing to hide from. There's nothing to hide from, as has been said so many times. The same higher power made both of us.
It's beautiful. So I am going to bounce around a little bit from our questions, because I think as we're flowing in this, it's going in a few different places. But One of the questions actually relates to what you just said, Dr. Love, which when you hear that drop in volume, that phenomena is actually quite widespread, and some of it, as you say, is an unconscious realization, and some of it is also from an interesting dynamic, and this may be a generational shift. But in my generation, when I was growing up, we were taught that the most thoughtful and respectful way to refer to the Black community was to refer to the Black community as African American, which of course could probably be a 2-hour conversation just about where that terminology comes from and what it is intended to mean and who created it and for what purpose. But can you help us just, for those of us who sometimes at this moment in particular may feel like we are potentially walking through a minefield, right, where we may not even realize that we're about to do something that could be actually really quite upsetting. Can you help us to understand at this point in time, is there a preferential terminology? Are the terminologies interchangeable? Are they intended to impart different kinds of feelings or expectations? And my guess is that this is not a question that has a single answer, that it is very likely contextual. So I won't put you on the spot to have the answer, but if you can give us anything that would be helpful so that we can say Black loudly and proudly, as well as you just said it yourself, Dr. Love, that would be helpful, I think, for a lot of us.
Yeah, I have been a lot of different names. I've been colored, I've been African American, and colored was interesting because I wondered what color, but colored, I've been African American, I've been Afro American, I've been Black, I've been all these things. And in my lifetime, I've had to become comfortable with all of them. And so there was none that I was stuck on that I had to be, in fact, hold on to as though it was not, as though it was really the way to do it. So like you said, there is no the way. One of the things that I do with people as often as I can is to ask them how they would like to be referred to. The same thing is, because some will have a difference. Some will want to be referred to differently, and that's okay. We do that with our transgendered and people. Is what are your pronouns? We ask those kinds of questions because we know that everybody has a different way of identifying themselves. Well, so do Blacks.
If we learn nothing else tonight, just what you just shared, right? That teaching of ask what you would like to be called. That is profound. I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that that is a profound kind of statement. And I appreciate you sharing it exactly in that kind of way. Right? Many learning examples for tonight already.
And some people will be uncomfortable with asking that. Should I
you know what?
ask him what he would like to be
that will
called?
be okay too.
Yep.
The best kind of learning is certainly from discomfort. And I think about this a lot. It's a sort of funny thing that happens, with Jewish people, right? I can refer to another Jewish person as a Jew, but if somebody walked down the street and said, "Hey, there's a Jew over there," my reaction to that is going to be very, very different, right? The context around it is going to be very different, even though it means exactly the same thing. Who it comes from, what tone is put behind it, and what is intended to say. And just as somebody pointed out in the chat, the idea, of course, that all people who are Black come from Africa or identify with African heritage, of course, is also a fallacious concept to begin with. And that's part of why I phrased it at the beginning of sort of, this is work that I have to do in understanding the origins of the terminology. And even if it originated in positive terms, right, how easily it can be manipulated and used, and we can imagine the many ways in which that would be the case for a negative purpose, right? And so I think, again, laying this out there for us tonight is extremely, extremely helpful. I'll put it in the eye. It's extremely helpful for me. I hope it is for our others as well. So thank you. Reverend Kimberly, I'm not sure if you had anything you wanted to add to that particular question. Otherwise, we can certainly move on.
Nope. I feel like that is a mic drop situation. If you're wondering how I prefer to be addressed, I refer to myself as Black. You can as well. I'm wearing for you, in honor of you, my all Black Lives Matter T-shirt. Black trans lives matter. Black women's lives matter. Black incarcerated lives matter. We are Black.
Yes, and it's so important to say that, and to make sure that we say it here, that saying Black Lives Matters does not mean that other lives don't matter. In fact, if you want to say that all lives matter, you got to say Black Lives Matter first, because they haven't mattered up until this point in so many places.
So one other question, sort of working backwards a little bit, because, you know, as we were talking about how some of this conversation, you know, hopefully is not terribly uncomfortable for some of us, but I hope that it is to some degree. And there is I think actually a helpful phrase that has reached a certain prominence right now, which is white fragility. And I think actually that terminology, at least to me, is somewhat new, but actually extremely helpful. Because, you know, and it's indicative also of a larger conversation about what fragile means, right? Our assumption is automatically that to be fragile, to be vulnerable, is always inherently a negative thing. It may be in this case at its outset, but it is also the opportunity for the greatest amount of growth, right? If one is rigid, right, if one can't be broken, there is no chance of change. If we are broken down, then we can be rebuilt back up again. So can you just give us a sense from your either personal experience or your experience within the movements that are going around, how do we understand this terminology, and how do we understand it in such a way that it actually helps us in the conversation about race and racism, as opposed to makes us feel like, again, we've got to go, you know, put our arms
So
up.
let me go first, because I might make people defensive, and then Dr. Love can smooth it over.
I don't know that that'll happen, but okay.
So I am familiar with that term from Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the book White Fragility, which is, by the way, published by Beacon Press, one of our Unitarian Universalist publishing houses. So I understand white fragility as this inability or unwillingness for white people to talk about race without tears or guilt or shame or defensiveness. And to, rather than have an actual and real and productive conversation about race, fall back on these things of defensiveness or guilt or shame as a way to shut down or derail conversation. I would much rather someone be not fragile, but resilient, right? We can be resilient, we can bend, but we are still rooted and not easily uprooted by the slightest blow of the wind. So one of the ways that I have experienced white fragility, you may have heard this term, white tears. And you probably have heard the term white tears in reference to white women's tears. More than once, I have been in a conversation where we are talking about race, and a white woman has hurt feelings and dissolves into tears because their feelings are hurt, because they're misunderstood, because they're afraid that they're not being fully understood. And now, rather than have the conversation about race, all of the energy has gone to soothing this white woman who was crying. That is an example of white fragility that is not helpful, not productive, actively harmful.
Right, and it disembowels people. It causes people to really start to work, and of course, we want to respect that person's right to have their feelings. The problem is it takes away from the discussion, and that then becomes white fragility. And it becomes, even for African Americans, oftentimes they become less willing to talk about it when someone breaks down in tears, and particularly white women break down in tears. They become less empowered, and therefore then won't talk about it. They will quiet down, you know. And as a counselor, I've often talked about that sometimes when someone is yelling and screaming, it's a good idea to whisper. All right, and because they then have to be quiet to hear what you're saying. But when it comes to dealing with talking about racism or talking about discrimination or talking about prejudice, I think we need to be willing to talk about it, get uncomfortable, experience the uncomfortable feelings, and remember what the rabbi said earlier. You know, it's from that kind of discomfort comes a lot of healing, a lot of growing. And healing our past experiences is a great way for us to start to tend to and attend to changing this planet from planet Earth to planet love.
Mm.
And listen, we all have feelings. When you have big feelings, that is the time to go talk to your pastor or your rabbi or your chaplain or your spiritual director. And if you don't have any of those things, then I want to recommend that you figure out a way to be in some kind of spiritual relationship, because this is actually spiritual work.
Mm.
Mm. That brings me to thinking about that in terms of when, you know, I've been involved in educating some of the police officers at the academy, all right, and also in helping to review some of their implicit bias training, all right, and responding to it. And people say, well, if they've been trained or if they're getting trained, why is there still this stuff going on? And my favorite, not favorite, but my constant comment is, because you can't train away a person's spirit and their heart and their belief system. That has to come from working with either a counselor. You left out counselors in that in your list, all right, and our spiritual leaders. Yeah, our spiritual leaders, because you could be both.
Look, I remember as a small child, people telling me one day I'd either be a rabbi or a shrink, and I keep asking people, somebody show me the difference here, you know.
Yeah, there's not
other
really.
than this cool hat I get to wear. Other than that, I think we got some similarities, and not to make light of what I think were extremely important points, but I also want to thank you, Dr. Love, as a parent. You just taught me an incredible skill about when somebody's yelling, talking a quieter voice. That is the exact opposite of what I do. So we are learning in all sorts of ways tonight, and I'm going to send you a fruit basket and thanks for that one. That is a gift.
That is so common.
No, but in all seriousness, right? I mean, I think that this is also a real challenge, actually one that probably is more challenging than most of us may realize. That in order to have the real conversations in life, in order to have the hard conversations in life, there's going to be some tears, right? There's going to be some raw emotions. There's going to be some discomfort. There's going to be some even disappointment or shame or whatever it might be. But that if we co-opt the conversation, right? If we make that conversation about us, that's a good litmus test in general. If the conversation starts about talking about a group of people or a big idea, and by the end of the conversation we're talking about an individual, then that conversation has not achieved its goal. Okay? And it doesn't mean that you have to go into it with intention, right? If you start to feel, as Reverend Kimberly points out, that you're having those big feelings, there are lots of ways to process that, and there's lots of opportunities to do that work. But we have to be very careful, especially right now, that we are not drawn away from the major conversation that is in front of us, which is about racial injustice in this country right now. That does not mean that other issues or other things that are coming up or other things that relate to other parts of the world or other things. There is time to deal with each of these issues. Each issue must be given its attention. But if we conflate every issue, if we make it all the same, if we amalgamate it, we are missing our opportunities. We are really, truly doing damage, not helping. And I think that is really one of the great opportunities for us to learn tonight, is to remember that, because it is all too easy to be drawn into, right, the rhetorical straw man, so to speak, right? Pay attention to this other thing so that you don't focus on what is in front of us. You know, my hope is that, again, that we are talking about building coalitions of understanding, of friendship, so that when each of us, our each individual communities, whatever it might be, when we are struggling in one form or the other, that we have, and this is what relates to our next question as a segue, right? We keep hearing this word allies. Right? So we want to know, like, what does that mean, especially right now, to be an ally? I'm going to add a couple of additional pieces to this, which if you forget, you can ask me. But first of all, how do we conceive of what that means as a general concept? What does it mean to be an ally? And more specifically, how can we be an ally to meet some of the most critical needs that the two of you would identify in our local community here on the East End? And the last thing, I know I'm throwing a lot at you here, but the last piece
I have to write them down.
I was going to say, and don't worry, if I will be happy to go back to them, but I just see them as related questions. how do you see the role of education? Because we've touched on that at the beginning, especially about the importance of schools, of curriculum, of teachers, of administrators, of superintendents, of colleges and universities, of the people who endow those colleges and universities, right? How do we see each of these elements playing together? How can we best ally? How can we best ally here in the East End? And how can we also use that power of allyship, that working together, especially to start to address some of the underpinnings of the systemic aspect of this, which I think all of us have identified in one form or the other tonight, are deeply rooted in education or the lack thereof. So with that, I will then step back and, as I said, if you forget any part of that 8-part question, just tell me and I'll be happy to answer it again. Or ask it, I should say.
I lost track. Who goes first?
Yeah, doesn't matter. Go ahead.
Yeah.
I got, I can pick up anywhere from us.
Okie dokie.
Yeah.
So I have just finished working on a presentation about this that I'm going to do later this week. So I think of an ally as a helper, right? A person who uses their power and privilege to help someone in an oppressed group. It is, think of it as individual or interpersonal. I have increasingly been encouraging people to be, if you can, not only an ally, but also an accomplice. What makes an accomplice different than an ally is that an accomplice, rather than working at the level of the personal or the interpersonal, works at the level of the institutional and the systemic. So an accomplice is a person who uses their power and their privilege to dismantle systems of oppression. Both are important. We need helpers, we need accomplices. It's useful to have a sense of what's the difference and to have an understanding of where you feel best suited to serve. Not everyone has the skill to be an accomplice. Not everyone is willing to take that risk of being an accomplice. It is a lot more risky to challenge authority and systems of oppression. Both of them require that you be in good relationship with people who are oppressed. Both of them expect that you are going to follow the leadership of people who are most directly affected by whatever the issue is. But I think of one of them as interpersonal, as a helper, and the other one as a, I don't know, what's my alternative to helper? Somebody who's going to tear stuff up. Avoiding curse words.
Agitator?
Okay.
I'm not in the sanctuary, Kimberly. You can say what comes to mind, you know? That's all right.
Yeah. Yeah,
I understand.
Yeah, I Kimberly, well put. I think that being an ally also includes things like helping people to help themselves. Sometimes we think that we're giving a hand out as opposed to a hand up. And giving a hand up can be to empower them by sharing and mutating our skills. I was talking the other day at a rally in Riverhead, and I talked about the idea of Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. That he's been to the mountaintop, and when he looked over, he saw the promised land. I said, I'm tired of looking over at the promised land. I want us both to be on the top of the mountain and make sure that we're sharing equally in the spoils of this nation, and that comes from an investment in saying, hey, it's not going to be lonely at the top anymore, because every time we get to the top, I'm going to bring you with me so that we can share in the spoils together. And that's not so easily done because people get frightened. It's even on the job. People get afraid. I have this with some of the people I supervise. People say, why are you letting that person who doesn't have your rank and training do the work that you are expecting or letting them do? I said, because I have this theory, happened to me in the Marine Corps. And the theory was that if I can teach you to do my job as well as I can, I could go on vacation and the job still gets done just as well. And my belief is that that empowers us and sends the message that I believe in you. You're just as valuable as I am. And just because someone attached the title to my name does not make me more than you. It just makes me different from you for now.
I think in some ways the shift, for me, the shift to accomplice is also maybe about spiritual work, right? So, so somebody said strong advocate. I think that's still an ally. I think an ally does something for someone else. An accomplice recognizes that this is for all of us, that we are building something together. We call it beloved community in my faith, right? That it's not me and my interest and you and your interest. It is a recognition that we have a shared common interest, right? This like mutual destiny, and that's what we're working towards.
Oh, that's so real. I love that. I think that, you know, when I think about that, I think about things like how we're so stuck in these binary ways of looking at things. It's either good or bad, or right or wrong, as opposed to, you know, transitioning it to maybe it's neither of those. Maybe it's both of those. How about us looking at it? You know, when we look at education, and often in the classroom, I've said this, you know, the student is also a teacher and the teacher is also a student. Teach me, okay, things that I don't know, because I was not given all the brains. I was given one brain. And all of these wonderful works of knowledge out here can help us both, or all of us, arrive almost automatically to a place where we can make things better than the past.
This is great. I selfishly want to keep you guys here forever, but we were talking before that Reverend Kimberly in particular has been very hard at work all day long. So I want to start.
I can go a little later. This is pretty
okay,
fun.
good. So I just, because there were a couple other things that I think you know, are not insignificant. One of which is a request actually that came in, which is, can we do something that's aimed especially for children, right? Can we create a program in which we are creating, pedagogically speaking, opportunities in the East End community, in our religious communities? Can we think together? That's not something we have to answer tonight, but simply an opportunity, an invitation to be accomplices in this particular approach. Because I think the one thing that I would say of every faith tradition, every country, every nationality, every culture that's ever existed, the ones that have survived are the ones that have placed the greatest emphasis on education and on raising young people to be ideally better than the generation that preceded to them. And by better, I mean better equipped to handle the complexities of life, better suited to take in, as Dr. Love pointed out, a less binary view of the world. So perhaps we can think about ways to do that another night when we are less exhausted, but we will definitely try to do that. So forever offer that request. One question that came up, I know it's something personal, but I think actually is important in this, especially as we are talking about the idea that this is not especially on a systemic level, something that is going to have an easy answer tomorrow or the next day or the day after that, that there is an ongoing aspect to this. Part of our challenge, I think, as I identified to my congregation, is that we started, on our end of the equation, started to refer to the civil rights movement as a thing of the past, right? An accomplishment achieved. And therefore we can all, as Dr. Love did, you know, put our feet back up and rest and relax, when of course that it was a complete fallacy to begin with. But the question is, as you, let's put it to you are fighting day in and day out. You are struggling, you are challenging, you are teaching, you are educating. What do you do to keep yourself self-energized and inspired through the setbacks and frustrations that inevitably come in a long-term, especially complicated process like what we are undergoing together tonight, and what you have been doing very clearly for your entire lives? And you don't have to get too personal in this, but anything that you can advise us so that we don't lose hope, right?
Well,
don't get exhausted. Don't move on to the next thing because it's too hard.
I think that often for me, it's when I see tiny little successes happen. For little people, when I see little people transition to a place where they become leaders in their community. You know, one of the ways that I talk about with one of my other organizations today about helping little people become active and involved, is to teach them leadership skills and assign them leadership responsibilities as a part of their being the next level of people that we're going to be passing the baton to. All right, because as we age, and I'm getting a little bit historical, age, but as we age, we need to be able to have the next level of young folks take over. And I'm seeing a lot of that happening currently in some of the protests that I've been to and been a part of, and some of the young people in our town halls conversations. They're talking about, they're ready to say, no, that wasn't good enough, or no, that's not enough. Let's do something different. We need to stop worrying about embarrassing other people and realize that embarrassment is one of those soil things that you talked about. It's just the beginning. All right, and then we can move from there. When people are talking about, discussing things like racism or even talking about how people are misguided in the way they approach things. Young people need to take on leadership roles, and how can we help them do that? Teach them how to talk to people. Teach them to use the tone of their voice. Teach them to use their bodies. In the classroom, that's one of my favorite choices, is I will go, if someone is sleeping in my class, which doesn't happen that often.
I was going to say, nobody can do that.
Yeah, because I'm pretty loud. I will go and stand by their desk. I'll go and stand by their desk. And that's all I have to do. I can use my body to influence the choices or the decisions. And they'll get involved and startle and wake up. Some of the people next to them might push them or something. I don't even have to say anything. So using my body, using my leadership skills and talents, and even learning some from the people that I watch, because the young people can teach you a lot of stuff, and so it's really good to watch what they do too. I'm they're my educators, and I really, really pay a lot of attention to it. Using I statements and things like that, making sure that you're teaching people, like you said earlier, Rabbi, I'm going to keep it in the I. Well, that's important, because if you start saying you, people get on the defensive and they don't even want to listen to you. They don't even want to listen to you. But if you kind of frame it or reframe it in a I statement, they're often more likely to respond receptively. And if they don't, then at least you planted the seed.
Yeah, I'm as part of my awareness of that is knowing how guilty I am of that particular act, right? That royal we that slips in there all the time when I definitely mean I. So I'm looking at the camera right now and telling you these are I statements. Certainly tonight. I won't speak for everybody else, but I know where I am firmly planted on this one. But thank you, Dr. Love, again. And I cannot imagine a scenario where anybody would fall asleep in any class that you ever taught, ever. As a matter of fact, if you ever thought to become a rabbi, you got my vote. I would be right behind it.
I'm coming.
Reverend Kimberly, I want to see if you want to jump in here for any of that.
I will. So I am a big proponent of having spiritual practice or spiritual discipline. And this is not about having the right thing, right? It's not saying that everybody has to go and pray for an hour a day. But I do think it's important that we have a practice that we can do with regularity and discipline, something that brings you back to yourself, that helps ground you, that helps you let go of those things that are no longer serving you. But that you can do with regularity and intention, so that you're not trying to figure it out when you're already worked up. And so I sort of cycle through. They're not always the same for me. Sometimes it is prayer. Sometimes it's meditation. Sometimes it's music. If you are a very, very, very early bird, you might see me on one of the East Hampton beaches at sunrise, listening to music and sometimes crying. That is just how I am letting go. But whatever it is finding for yourself the thing that works for you that you can do with regularity and intention that helps you let go of those things that aren't serving you and ground you in who you are, your most authentic self, and how you can express that most authentic self in the world.
Oh, I love that. You know, I like talking about authenticity. It's so hard for us because, you know, we often are subject to the imposter syndrome, where we don't think we belong. We think we have to perform in order to keep our status. When in fact, being real is so much more authentic and so much more comforting to ourselves. And I agree with you about prayer, and I agree with you about meditation. You know, as a hypnotist, because I'm a hypnotist, I also often use meditation and hypnosis to help people find that balance and that calm, and encourage them to do that to music, you know, to have music in the background, soft music. Even when we talk about children, I was talking this morning about when talking to children, you know, we have to recognize that children have a hard time transitioning from one thing to another. So if they're outside playing ball and whatnot, you can't bring them right in and then tell them, okay, take your bath and get in the kitchen and have your dinner. You know, how about setting up some transitions for them? How about putting some soft music on? And how about maybe having a brief meditation with them, so that when they go to the next phase of their experience, it'll be an easier transition. You know, that's why they have spaces between periods in school, all right, and so that they can have a transition. And we need to encourage that, you know, and one way to do it is to model it. I'm so into modeling. The Course in Miracles, which is a class that I often teach, talks about, you know, in one of their lessons, there's 365 lessons, is that we should sit in the middle of a room and close our eyes and then reopen our eyes and look around the room and say to ourselves out loud, nothing in this room matters to me, and nothing in this room is that important except the importance that I give it. So how important is this? How can I make this be equitable or equal? And one way is to get in touch with ourselves and our spiritual self. So I always appreciate when someone talks about spiritualism, because that's one of my love things, is to be spiritual.
Amazing. I know that we are running very late on time here, but there is one other piece here, which is a recurring question, which I'm not sure that there's a single answer. But for those of us that are really, again, trying to take the opportunity, certainly to learn and to educate ourselves and to grow and to challenge, there is also the sort of practical aspect of this, which relates to our question earlier about being an ally or an accomplice. If you could give us a sense of, especially right here on the East End, right where we are living right now, what would you identify as some of the most pressing issues, concerns, opportunities, and how do we ally? How do we accomplish? I'm not sure that that's a word in that sense of verbing it, but you know, in other words, how can we act upon what it is that we are starting to learn about tonight with the two of you, and where would you give us the opportunity to learn more and to engage more? And again, even if you say to us, you know, follow me on Facebook and you will see regular opportunities for, but if there's anything that really at the forefront of your mind where you are right now, that you can share with us tonight as sort of a beginnings of the end of our conversation tonight, that would be extremely helpful.
You want to go first, Kim, or you want me to go first?
I'm going to go first because mine is a little bit of a non-answer.
Okay.
They're used to non-answers around here. That is my MO. Don't worry.
So the real honest answer is that I'm not in a good enough and accountable enough relationship with communities of color out here to be able to speak for communities of color out here on the East End. I can tell you issue-wise, I know that just and affordable housing is an issue. I know for myself, decarceration is an issue. If you want an organization that you can look for, I want you to look into New Hour. who is doing work that I respect and I try to partner with. I am newly on the board of the Sound Justice Initiative. I think that there is some sound justice
I was going to say, I think they're on.
on this webinar. So my short answer is, issue-wise, I know that housing is important. Personally, for me, decarceration is essential. And I am just not, regretfully, lamentably, in the kind of accountable relationship with communities of color out here to be able to speak for them.
I appreciate, again, your honesty and your candor about that, but I think you've already given us, whether you realize that it was not a non-answer. You answered it exactly as you should have in that moment, and it was already extremely helpful. So Kimberly, the Reverend Kimberly, thank you, really.
Yeah, I think that was definitely not a non-answer. It's a very real and very substantive answer. I also would add to that, you know, sometimes what we lose sight of is, how can we expose people to each other? Are there ways that we can increase that exposure? You know, in books like Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? You know, identifies how important it is. I mean, there's reasons for that are very, very, that are issues of connecting and connection and stuff like that. But also is because people are so often to staying with their own brethren, as opposed to being, you know, exposed to people who are different. So in my classes, I say, change your seat. You must sit next to someone different every class. Or in the cafeteria, I will go and sit with the wrong group, okay? The ones who think that I don't belong there. I will go and sit and hang with them, because I think that kind of modeling says I don't have to belong to one particular perspective. So I recommend that our allyship, or allyship, if that's a word, I don't know, I'll add a couple of syllables to it, all right, would include encouraging people to hang with people who are different, to learn about people who are different. You know, I was once told that, you know, you call yourself Dr. Love, why are you Dr. Love? I said, I don't call myself, I said, the students gave me that. And I said, it's like I carry around this barrel of warm fuzzies and I'm handing them out all the time. And people say, well, aren't you afraid you're gonna run out of love and warm fuzzies? I said, no, because while I'm handing them out over here, someone over here is putting new ones in. So it's constantly replenished. So my response is, you know, modeling it, teaching leadership, and most importantly, learning from them, watching them, learn what it is they have to teach us, because they have so much that they can teach us. You know, I think that kind of helps me to pay attention to the fact that listening to their perspective and listening to the way they handle things, watch how they socialize with each other or don't socialize, and encourage change, you know, those kinds of things.
So I want to read one of the comments from the chat. From an Indigenous person that I am, I hope, in good and accountable relationship with. Holly Hale Thompson reminds us that a concrete thing that we can do is remembering to honor the Indigenous peoples with a territory acknowledgement in every meeting. I think somebody had asked about education, right? We can be clear and honest in our education about structural racism historically and in the present. This is not a thing that happened 100 years ago or 50 years ago. So being clear and honest about what we're doing here, this land that we are on, and what it cost.
You know, the genocide. Yeah, the genocide and things that were done to our Native brothers and sisters, you know, that kind of stuff needs to be part of the education of our young people. They need to understand that the lands that they have really taken away from them, all right, and built their houses on, things are important pieces of education for them to not recognize. You know, I very quickly, I had a conversation with a young person in my class last semester, and they said, you know, I said to him, what if a Native American came and brought a refrigerator box and put it in your driveway and said, I'm going to live here from now on? What would you do? He said, I would call the cops, I would do something. I said, what if he then said to you, this isn't your land, this is mine and yours. It's all of ours, because the land does not belong to an individual, it belongs to all of us. Okay, we need to have access to it, all right? But because people have been, it has been taken away or wrested away from people, the necessity for ownership and understanding who in fact was here first is so important, because that gives you license to believe or to belong there, you know. And so many houses and things are on sacred burial grounds and things like that. That is horrendous. That is horrendous. So I concur and thank that participant for bringing it up, because we should never have a conversation about racism or discrimination at all without talking about what has happened to our Native American brothers and sisters.
And I think that that's, you know, indicative again certainly the two of you and your grace of giving us the time tonight to help to teach us and to educate us and to show us again the interconnectivity of all of this, right? That this conversation is both a specific conversation, one that is about a moment in time and a particular movement, but it is also something so much larger than that, right? This is the eternal challenge that human beings have struggled with from the beginning, right? It is something that we have given every excuse as to why we have not dealt with it, why we have not addressed it, why we have not changed. And I hope and I pray, and I truly do, that this is a different moment in the history of this country, in the history of humanity. Because I think what we have seen is that it is not unique to us right now. This conversation is now happening all over the world, even in places with very, very small populations, right, of Black, African American, whatever we might determinize as it is, right? South Korea, for example, right? Huge protests in the streets, right? It's because there is something here that, again, is really hitting into our essence and into our core.
China, it's happening everywhere.
Exactly, and I think that, you know, again, the emphasis on learning, on education, on growth, we can sometimes hide behind those words, right? We can hide behind them and say, okay, we're learning, we're growing, we're determining that for ourselves. Most of the time, that is not something we can determine for ourselves. We have to be reflected upon, right? They have to see our work together. We have to see our ability, again, to confront our greatest challenges, to confront, especially as we said, and I'm going to put this again in the eye, right? My fragility, my supremacy, all of these things, right? Me. And I don't mean to make it about me. I'm just saying that I think every one of us should be able to, at this point, after tonight, right, to identify our place in this conversation, and not just to identify our place in it, but to get involved, to jump in. We may make mistakes, we may say things that were wrong, we may have said things in the past that we are ashamed of, but it is going to take a true courage to move past this moment. And we have to really, really begin that work in earnest. And I think that I cannot imagine a better way to start that process for my community, speaking on behalf of my community, to begin that process with the two of you tonight. Remarkable, exceptional, authentic, deep, spiritual job of teaching us tonight. And I just, on a personal level and on behalf of my congregation, to thank you for the time, for the energy, for the care with which you have shared tonight, and with the honesty with which you have shared tonight. I know that we had some things planned for last minute opportunities here. So Andy and Alyssa, you'll forgive me. I know you can't see me, so I hope you'll forgive me tomorrow. I just very quickly will say, and we want to give each of our presenters an opportunity just to shout out their organizations and how to get involved. But from the Temple standpoint, for those of you who are members or those that maybe have never heard of us before, we do have this social justice committee. We are attempting to do what we hope is meaningful work. If you want to engage with it, please, you have my email now. You should have all gotten an email from me at some point tonight. You can email me. I will connect you with our co-chairs. We would love your involvement. If you know organizations that we can partner with and work with, please do let us know. And I want to give the last word to our wonderful presenters tonight, to Reverend Kimberly, to Dr. Love. Truly, thank you both. And anything that you would like to share as parting words. And remember, I will emphasize this again, this was a starting point of a conversation. This is by no means the end of it. There is a tremendous amount more to discuss, and we might have to impose upon the two of them again, probably not so far in the future, to come back and to help us continue with this learning. But I want to make sure that our last words tonight go to the two of you. So anything that you would like to share as parting words, we would appreciate. Or just good night. That is also. I'm tired.
You know,
it's an acceptable answer as well.
Yeah, I would like to part by saying I am honored to have had this opportunity to work with yourself and Reverend Kim. I think that your enlightenment and your ability to really process the information that we were talking about is going to take us and the people who have been listening miles beyond where we were before. And that is special. I also wanted to acknowledge your social justice group, because I think that the fact that they wanted to sponsor this program and work with this program is imperative. You know, the things we didn't even get to talk about, you know, like police brutality and stuff like that, were catalysts for this kind of discussion, you know, and we're not going to forget about those things. And I'm not going to allow it to happen as it has so often in the past, when I've watched water cannons and things shot at my people and dogs sicked on them. I'm not going to allow that to happen this time without saying I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take this anymore. But thank you so much for your calling upon us and for the wonderful contribution. Reverend Kim, you are special.
Here, here.
And so are you, Rabbi. I appreciate both.
Hey, that's a secondary concern.
I think I want to echo that. I want to thank you all, and especially your social justice team, for putting this together. It is really the beginning. I mean, it probably should be the middle of a conversation, but we start where we start. Let's say this is part of an ongoing conversation. I want to remind people in my congregation and my community that I am your pastor. And if you have big feelings about this conversation or the larger conversation, I am the person that you talk to. I am a professional. You don't have to worry about hurting my feelings. You don't have to worry about coming to me with your white tears or your white fragility. Yeah.
Well, I'm not fire again, but I might be making a call to you at some point or another, Reverend. So.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Me
too.
Well, let me just say, you two are loud. That is not that's not a general offer for any white person who wants to come cry at me. That is a reminder to the people that I am in relationship with, that I am your pastor, and that is part of the covenant of our relationship.
Indeed.
And I would like to say, one other closing remark that I wanted to say was, please, folks, go out and vote. Do not allow voting to pass you by without voting both locally and nationally in the next elections. And I want to say also, complete the census, because that is so important to bringing income and money into the communities. Those are things that we have to attend to, because in the past, Long Island has suffered in terms of having people participate in both of those areas. And I'm going to say it one more time. I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. We got to do something about this. It's got to be some changes.
I can't think of a more important way to end tonight. And luckily for us, we got tomorrow to prove that we were listening tonight. Okay? So
Right.
Dr. Love's going to find out if you didn't listen. He's going to find you. Not okay. Tomorrow, people, and every opportunity for the rest of your life. Okay?
Yeah.
Essential. Thank you both again. Thank you to all of our attendees. I know that's a bit unusual that you couldn't engage directly with us, but I hope very much that, again, that we will continue this conversation, each in our own communities together, and to know, for whatever we can do, that myself, temple that I am really privileged to represent, that if we can be helpful in any way, shape, or form, I hope that we will have that opportunity. And really, thank you both again from the bottom of my heart on a very personal level for staying late into the evening and helping us learn tonight. So thank you all. However you define the word God, God bless you. And really take care of yourselves. Also, on top of everything else, please be smart. Wear your masks. Tell other people to wear masks, please, for the love of God. You know, there's going to be a picture of me and my family up somewhere in Sag Harbor eventually with us with our masks on, trying to get people to do it. So please, 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 it's for everybody's sake, please. But that doesn't mean that you can't get in the streets and do work. Okay, there's a give and a take here. Just be smart about it and be safe. Okay, God bless you all. And this, as we said, is recorded. It'll take me a little bit of time, but I'll get it up online. You can share it as widely as you feel comfortable. And let's keep the good work going. Really.
Please know that I'm embracing my screen with a hug.
Right here, warm fuzzies, man.
Yeah, that's how we roll.
That's it. That's it.
Or a little elbow tap. We'll just do an elbow
exactly.
tap.
We're gonna model. We're gonna model the good behavior. That's it.
Yeah, yep.
Hey, Reverend Kimberly, get some sleep. Well earned. Well earned.
Thank you both and
Truly.
all panel. Right.
Okay. Take care, everybody. Good night.
Good night.